Now, if your life maybe lacks excitement and you're like, what's my career stage? Where am I progressing? And you think international arms dealer, that's my calling, that's my vocation, then I have good news for you because I will give you the introduction into how you specifically can become a international arms dealer, a la Lord of War here, Nicolas Cage. And obviously, facetiousness aside, this is a video on just the economics of what is the deal with arms dealing, because there's a misapprehension around a lot of the elements that go into, say, foreign wars, the smuggling, black market of arms, but also the legitimate version of arms dealing and the economics behind it, because it plays a super important part in the political landscape of particularly international politics. Arms makers and manufacturers, the sources of production, so the countries which are net exporters of arms, have an you could say, sized elemental capacity to influence politics in that way. So how do we go about understanding that geopolitical landscape factor? And then also how you specifically can see yourself enriched by the trade of arms to third world shitholes. So basically, if you've not seen Lord of War is a Nicolas Cage movie, which I highly recommend, about some Ukrainian, Russian, say, arms dealer in the 1990s. So the fall of the Soviet Union, it was estimated, I think it was about $90 billion worth of arms in the Ukraine specifically, and then on the next audit, there was about $30 billion of it missing. So you can see, understand how exactly the economics of a exporting of or a smuggling of arms is galvanizing certain people to enrich themselves in certain ways, but also it's done under the assurances of certain, say, government or pseudo-governmental agencies. And so here, I'll just start you off with the quote from the first monologue in the start of the movie, where he says, "There are over 550 million firearms in worldwide circulation. That's one firearm for every 12 people on the planet. The only question is, how do we arm the other 11? Which I always find very pertinent and somewhat poignant. So the question does become, what is the state of conflict internationally? Why is it that we, as a species, love war? And how exactly do countries influence other countries to continue the habituation of war in that way? So firstly, I think it's important to understand that almost the whole globe, and you can see the world here, has been at war with each other, one another, internecine, civil, all types of wars, clandestine, guerrilla, partisans, all sorts of different structures, paramilitaries, you can say police forces, have the ability to arm themselves in the purpose of a certain outcome. So if it's to protect, if it's to establish certain fiefdoms, if it's to invade, if it's to police, whatever the outcome might be desired, there's a necessity of force projection and on that guise violence and controlled violence. So war becomes a matter of arms and armament, in which case you can understand that manufacturing has a large degree of sophistication required to mass scale this stuff, and then particularly in the technics side of things, the best type of arms. You don't want to be carrying around a flintlock musket in 2022, because in 2022 you'd rather have an AK-47. In 2030, in 2030 you'll have a laser drone gun, and in 2050 maybe you'll have a private nuclear weapon, kind of like Fallout or something. But in general, we have this idea that techniques goes hand in hand with arms and with armament, with warfare. Spengler goes on a lot about this, the idea that we have developed the taste for war before weapons were involved. And so in engineering weapons, really we're just trying to make optimize and efficiency gains on warring as a species. So we're able to kill more with, say, more sophistication specific. But in general, you can find the top 10 exporters here of arms are the countries you most suspect. These are the ones that you've heard of in terms of international global politics the most. It's the United States, France, Russia, China, Germany, Italy, United Kingdom, Spain, Israel, and South Korea. The idea that you would make arms to sell to other countries goes down to two things: scale. So the more you can make of something, the more efficient it becomes, the cheaper it becomes. So it's nice to not just domestically produce, because you'll saturate the market fairly quickly. And if you make a good product, you can still make money as a country off of that, even if that means arming your potential enemies with weapons as sophisticated as your own. There will be a lot of programs which are secret and safe and don't have anywhere near as much export capacity, but in all other instances, you make mass-produced weapons so that you can sell them to make money as much as you can influence global politics, which is just a nice bonus. But nevertheless, you have this idea that production is centralized geographically, and it's maintained sophisticated armament selection and production in the ways the government controls. This is probably the most highly regulated manufacturing, you could say, sector or industry in the world. Every country will have very strict requirements around what type of weapons can be produced, what necessary equipment, inputs, and security clearances, all of these things that go into this, what planning phases. You work very intertwined and in close concert with departments of defense or your Ministry of Defense or whatever country governance system you have in terms of keeping the people safe. And this also goes all the way back into R&D. R&D being the first stage, you could say, what should we be researching? What problem are we trying to solve? What technology is available? What materials are available? How exactly do we go about understanding that interaction? And so you employ your big brain scientist boys, galaxy brains, to engineer these solutions for you, and then you put them into planning, production, and then after that comes commercialization. So you can see how the logical steps around this have progressed and why the West is the foremost frontier of arms development and the acme of, you could say, procurement planning. Now, that goes a little bit into the next part, which is understanding the legality of this. So why is it that we have legal and illegal firearms? Why is it that specifically governments can mandate something to be legal in one country and not illegal in another? And it goes a lot into the self-interest of the country, but ultimately we'll go into who has the most say. And if America tells you you have to join an alliance with certain requirements around this, then you will just approbate that and agree and acquiesce. And then that's more or less how you're structured around who am I allowed to trade with and what. So there's an embargo against Russia instituted by NATO, which is basically America. So America's political weapon arm. They said you're not allowed to trade. And what happens then? No one sells Russia arms. And you can see here that in this chart, at least, the percentage change of global export for Russia, particularly for armaments, is down 53%, which is a lot, you see, particularly because a lot of Russia's exports, if they're not oil and gas, are things like arms. So now their main trade supplier is China, but that's a bad relationship for Russia because China makes better stuff cheaper. So Russia gets less out of that relationship than China gets out of it. But then, then there's a high level of tech sharing and sabotage as well in that relationship. But still, you can now see the relationship between embargoes and the idea that you can make some form of trade illegal that was erstwhile legal. As if I now declare this country to be a nation at war, or I declare them to be, their government to be committing war crimes, or there's some military junta or something's taken over in a coup, I can say that this disqualifies them as a trade partner, and then now I'm going to sell them arms. But, and this is where the interesting part becomes manifest, is that you have clandestine activities which still seek to arm those countries who are in the grips of conflict, which can be the case that the public side, PR-facing side of your government says, look, we abhor this conflict, it's a terrible waste of human life, blah, blah, blah. And then the undersided version of your country goes, but we're still going to sell them weapons because it makes us a lot of money, and we want to try out new types of weapons, and we have a surplus of this, and we need to get rid of it, so we want to trade it for something that they have. And this is where you have that crypto quasi-legality to it. So it's not that they're banned from receiving weapon shipments, it's just they're banned from directly procuring them from your country. And so you change the country of origin, or you use a broker, you use a supplier who sits outside of your jurisdiction, things like this. This is where you start to see that mapped across. The legality of something is a very fuzzy term that's usually only typically applied to the normie process. It's to say most people feel fine if they tell voters that they're doing something that's legal because it's legal, and everyone feels like they attribute the word legal to a moral claim, whereas illegal obviously is the opposite. And so the contrary to this is that if you're doing something illegal, it must mean it's bad and you're a bad person. And with weapons, it becomes a matter of national interests, which supersede and are insuperable. And they are just the foremost primary reason for the zenith of existence. It's like the continuation of our country is the most important part of being a nation. Therefore, we'll do whatever is justified to make that, ensure that happens. So you have then the companies which themselves become basically state-backed in most ways. If it's not by mandated production for your own Department of Defense, it's through regulated trade that you're monitoring in many, many ways. So Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, General Dynamics, BAE Systems, Airbus, Leonardo, Almaz, Anti, and Thales, the largest top 10 arms producer, most of them American. You have other companies like Rheinmetall and even Rolls-Royce in UK, which make say engines, particularly for planes being one of the most important parts of the armed delegation that you might have, Air Force. So you can understand how the interweb of technology and manufacturing goes straight into these arms and straight into the politics of this. Very sensitive. It's a little bit similar to maybe the food previously, or energy supplies, things like this, security around energy, oil and gas in particular. So you can understand how there's a complex array of certain requirements and things that you should be thinking about. The point, I guess, is more globally that it's a very important sector for economic, but specifically geopolitical reasons, and that you want to maintain your lead in the arms race in a way that makes it not a burden. So if someone else can pay for your product development, then that's a win for you, as well as being able to ensure global continuity around a certain, for America it's a hegemony, but previously it's been a plurality or a multipolarity world where if you were able to at least maintain a certain level of edge technologically, then you were the threat, and being a threat is obviously almost as good as actual violence. So the idea that Prussia had its own arms in the 18th century was very important, integral to the idea that Prussia could continue to be its own state in Central Europe, even though it was under a consistent threat. And the idea was that Prussia was so efficient at this, they made guns which were mass produced, and they were not very good quality, but what they could do are two things. They could arm every single soldier. So historically, not every soldier has had a weapon. Some of them are marched into battle, waiting for the person in front of them to die, and they take that arm, or they swap and they come out in the reserve column, will switch weapons. But it also allows for practice. So a man who's got his own weapon can practice with that weapon specifically many, many times, and is much more effective as a soldier. This goes into that scalability of arms that Prussia and then later Germany was so effective for. It's that one man can have the ability to wage war as equivalent to 5 of some other country's men. So that's the idea around weaponry, and that's a personal weaponry. So that's guns specifically, and previously to that it was swords, shields, how well you could armor someone in armor, horses, things like this. But now a modern warfare that goes all the way out into cybersecurity, AI. How exactly are you able to defend yourself using those certain sort of things, particularly drones as well? I think is going to be the next 5-10 years of warfare, specifically focused on the drone aspect. Now, this is a $500 billion industry, probably more, and you can see why it's very important to everyone, particularly those who perceive threats and or want something to have a way to contribute violence to a situation. How do I arm myself such that I can ask and or demand and or procure per force things that I want? I do it with a gun, and whatever. The idea, as Spengler says, that no one had the idea of a car, it's just we wanted to travel faster. No one had the idea of a gun, it's just we wanted to shoot, we wanted to kill someone who was further away from us than we are, so we don't die. So the risk minimization profile of a weapon is continuous. So how do we then scale that to that effect? And I think that goes into how you yourself can start to maybe understand what it is about being a weapons now that you're an arm dealer, or aspiring arms dealer yourself, and you want to be this nabob, and the Gothic spirit is calling to you to let's arm the world, let's be that Lord of War. Well, then you can think of yourself in any one of these positions in the value chain. So if you're not a producer, because it's very unlikely that you're a government-regulated producer of a weapon system, Palmer Luckey, who's a ex-Facebook Meta guy, I think, he made a company called Anduril, something, avionics or something like that, where he now makes these drone-ish style. So it can be done, like you can be an entrepreneur in the weapon space. It's not unheard of. And in this day of age of technology, AI, and automatic weaponry, as in automated, non-piloted, you can have a scalability effect which is unforeseen previously. And so it is entrepreneur's dream in many ways, because it's seen as a bit of a dirty industry. So it attracts many less smart guys who are more into maybe software programming for Google accounts tracking or something, where they feel like we can monetize this very fast and become billionaires, rather than saying like, let's make cool weapons. So it has a lot of room to grow in terms of the entrepreneurship that goes into it. But if that's not your nature, you're not a producer of weapons, you're a supplier maybe, you're a vendor, this can come down to being a contractor for supplying weapons. And so you have the ability to, on the behalf of something else, procure a weapon and then ship it. Then you can be a vendor to anybody in that space. Probably less likely to be able to sit in your office in London and do this unless you already have contacts. You much more actually sit in an office in Manila or in a war zone somewhere else, and you can see the map. Basically, any in third world shithole is at war in some way. If it's not an insurgency, a civil war, then it's an outright conflict with a neighbor. So you can think of many of these places requiring, on behalf of third parties, agents, sales vendors. And so it's very possible for you to go there and do this as a job, be the liaison for supplying weapons. You can also do logistics. So there's a large bulk of cargo shipped internationally, which represents weapons shipments. And the designation of how private and securitized that is varies. And so if there's a police force in Nicaragua ordering a few machine guns from America versus if there's tanks being shipped to Germany, for instance, from America, then there's a large differentiation between how that's done. But you can obviously think the logistics of these things is a very important task. And it's well within the realms of possibility for you to specialize in something like this around logistical supply and so drayage of weapons arms. It's not maybe as sexy, it goes much more into transportation efficiency than it does anything else, but you could still claim to be a nabob on the back of one of these cool war conflict supplying ventures. The one you see here, so the I think this guy Danny was from Blood Diamond, so he was doing diamonds, but the trade is very similar, if not a inverse of trading stones for guns is very common. So because when you think about raw material, you almost transform arms into a barter system, because the value of the gun is worth either American dollars or it's worth something that the country has. Most of these countries have very unsophisticated economies, so in that they mostly have resources, not necessarily having cash. And so it's much easier to trade for diamonds or for oil and gas or for drugs, say like opium or meth or something. And in particular, in even less salubrious countries, you could trade for something like people. They do people smuggling all the time out of these countries. Just to shatter your worldview here, that the rest of the world, other than the West, is actually pretty barbaric in many ways still. So these trades are commensurate to one another in a lot of ways. You trade arms for certain things. And this is not like local gangs doing this. This is sophisticated international, quasi-corporatized versions of companies. And they do this under the certain remit of other international bodies. So there's an approval process. It's not, as I said before, it's not illegal. It's crypto legality here. And legal obviously being a nonsense term we all just use to manufacture a certain consent for stuff. But in general, you can think of that as the case for most of these trades are done through a dealer or a broker, and you take a large commission, you make ensuring that there's a delivery and swapping of whatever promise money or promise to pay or whatever it is. So it's lucrative, dangerous, and obviously requires a lot of hard work and grit. So that one maybe is your high flying, your first class on your own private jet to where a conflict zone is in most of need of your skill set. And you can see that here with, I'll just show you a chart, but basically it shows the German exports to Russia during the embargo. So in March 2022, there's a huge embargo against Russia in many ways, isolating their economy. So to do that, you have to functionally shut off their payment system. This is why SWIFT, which is like an international payment system, has banks which are allowed to transfer cash and all these sort of mechanisms. But if you shut everything off, then something needs to still happen with all the trade that was supposed to go there. And you can see here Germany upped its trade with Central Asia and Turkey on the exact day that the embargo went in. So clearly, obviously, Germany's still exporting the same amount of stuff to Russia. They just now have to be a bit more sophisticated about it, because the way that, as I said before, the domestic politics works is you really have chattel, and you're just having to lead them into their own decision making through a softer process, and saying, oh no, we're still being legal, we're still abiding. If people want to order in Uzbekistan instead of Russia for our very high class Mercedes or our Porsche, then that's what's going to happen. We'll continue to ship those Porsches to the large and very wealthy populace of Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan or whoever. So that's the idea there. Now the last two here is as options for your careers. Either you're an armourer, and that's someone who's specifically paid to outfit an army. This can be done usually through the domestic, so that is to say the country that you're working for is the country that hires you to outfit their army, paramilitary, whatever operation they're running. So you'll be brought in, you'll be told, and you can tell them this usually requires actually a much more higher level of understanding of a modern army and what's required in terms of arms, means, weapons, things like this, and how that all coalesces in a gestalt. But the idea that you could train yourself in modern warfare requirements, I think, is fairly accessible. You really just have to join your own army for a few years, go out and consult for another few years, and then after 10 years or so of being surrounded by armed services, you probably are familiar enough to be able to slip into a armourer style role, so working on behalf of the third world country and outfitting their troops, soldiers, things like that. The last one though is maybe more interesting, a soldier of fortune, so a condottiere or a mercenary. How exactly you think about providing weapons and arms and means specifically for conflicts that you're involved in. This goes into, although it's probably an adjacent category of being an arms dealer, but you're still required to understand the flow of arms and procurement of those things. And so that could be a career choice for you if you are more addicted to the conflict and the adrenaline of that than necessarily the money side. Although the money is still good, you can see the value chain is lessened at this end part where you're basically just paying directly at market prices for weapons that best serve whatever conflict you're currently embroiled in. And so from that, I think we can hopefully outline the vocational choices for you, the prospective acolyte of the Lord of War. And I think second part of that, and I mentioned earlier, is how you acquire the cash, the means, the trade. These are all connections, networks. They're very much involved in being there and doing these things. Most people instinctively have the idea that they enrich themselves at as low a risk as possible. So most people don't go into these deals feeling like they're going to backstab someone, steal all the weapons and then shoot you with them, because there's a constant need and supply of these weapons. So it's not really how they do business. So that's I think the basics of this is it's much less around the risk aspect as it is around, first of all, you're probably money laundering if you're doing this in an embargoed state. So if you're in Russia selling arms to Russians, you're going to have a lot of trouble with, and probably rightly so, with international agencies who are monitoring you very closely. But in general, you'll have to do something with cash, so you have to be quite financially literate. You have to understand that if you're trading for resources, like you're smuggling weapons into Afghanistan and trading it for poppies or heroin, then you'll now have to actually understand how the economics of drug dealing works. This goes into that complexity in that web. I guess the positive side here that I can outline for you is that most of these operations are run by illiterate mountain-bred living retards. So you'll outsmart most of them if you're just a Western-raised person, but then you won't understand maybe the cultural nuances which get them through some of these things, street knowledge, and then also how highly you regard your life can vary depending on where you're from. So there's a risk tolerance that maybe you'll not stomach so well. So it depends, once again, if you're familiar or comfortable with those sort of decisions. And so they say, most times you hear about arms dealing and trading, and particularly the illegal kind, black market, is under the protocol of the UN, and they have studies or whatever saying they don't appreciate the conflicts internationally which are causing innumerable amounts of death and harm, blah, 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 which we don't care about much more. It's around, okay, so here is the conflicts we approve of, here's the ones we don't, and the ones we're not enriching ourselves off are the worst because you're just killing each other for no reason, no purpose here. Stop doing that. But that's not a problem much as it is an opportunity for you, specifically the aspiring, as I say, Lord of War, now you know all the events in the realms of the world which are underserved from a market perspective. So once you identify opportunities like this, you'll be able to broker better deals, more profligate, but also higher margins. So you'll cut yourself fatter checks in that way. That could be also interesting. And so to finalize here, there's a quite neat little chart here that the UN was kind enough to give us around how the illicit production and or the licit production of weapons happens, and how that you can understand several different channels of sales or brokering trading goes through. So not only do you have the typical version of trading, which I've outlined for you, where you buy and sell on a marketplace through connections, make sure it's shipped, logistically secured. You have theft, obviously, so then you do talk gangs, and that's usually low amounts of weapons and not sophisticated weapons. So trading in AK-47s or grenades is probably much more a gang-related activity than, as I said before, anti-aircraft weaponry or HIMARS or tanks or armored vehicles, things like this, which have to be legitimized to a large degree. But you'll still have leakage. Most of these companies will procure, say, 10,000 of X, and then they'll ship 10,000, but maybe only 8,000 show up, 9,000 show up, and this is fairly common in a plagued industry, and one that requires bribes and other nefarious dealings. Then you have the recycling of arms, so things that have been used come back, but they're unregistered or registered, so there's something around that. There's a conversion of, say, illegitimate to legitimate, or the vice versa, that legitimate arms are now illegitimate due to certain changes to them or export directives. You can have a lot of the troops using arms in this way lose their procured weapons, specifically like guns. For instance, the largest leakage or loss in weapons out of the UN comes from peacekeepers, and it's not very hard to understand why, when the most or the majority of peacekeepers come from Bangladesh, Nepal, India, Rwanda, Pakistan, Ghana, Indonesia, and Egypt. High corruption countries, no onus on being responsible, on any self-agency, on anything other than enriching themselves in any way possible for their family or whatever back home, or themselves, to get into this sort of nastiness is very common for them, and that's basically part of the course. If you hire a fellaheen to do a first world war job, then you'll get a fellaheen job, and that's what they're saying. So large, you say, intergovernmental forces like NATO might have a better track record of leakage, but the UN obviously is dog shit, and anything under that, so superior. Well, if you think of maybe the African Union, if they had troops, or some Asian agencies probably have high levels of leakage in that way. And so this is how you can also think about the trade. Illicit weapons can stem from one gun somewhere all the way up to thousands or millions of bullets and guns. And so hopefully that's a fairly easy 101 on how the weapons trade is affecting the world globally, geopolitically, but also how it can specifically enrich you and your life. So hopefully that's helpful, and let me know if you want any more, because I can also do a part 2 on your specific career steps.